Discover the Our MedTech Lives podcast, where industry experts share their career stories, key achievements, and insights into overcoming challenges in the medtech field. Hosted by Zilka Rima and Kash Ikram.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our MedTech Lives. Today we have Larry Weiss, our first MedTech lawyer to join us. And Larry is Chief Legal Officer and Corporate Secretary currently at AngioDynamics. So welcome to our podcast, Larry.
Thanks so much, Kash and Silky. Really good to be with you today. And an
Welcome,
honor
Larry.
to be your first lawyer.
Yes.
Yeah, because we are so scared of lawyers. We discuss it later. Before we come to this point, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your career path, and how you got into MedTech? We hope it's not always by coincidence.
Sure. Well, there is a lot of coincidence or good luck in my path to working in the industry. But yeah, I've been a lawyer for over 30 years, which is hard to believe. And I was really fortunate after several years working at law firms here in Boston, where I live, had reached the conclusion that I didn't aspire to be a partner in a law firm, that wasn't going to be satisfying for me. Started looking at opportunities to work in-house at companies, and it was clear that I wanted to be more involved in the business of my clients. I'm a transactional lawyer by training, so I didn't want to just stop when the deal was over. And then as I started looking at opportunities, it was clear that I wanted to be in a business that made something. There's a lot of companies in the financial services industry here in Boston, great companies, but it just didn't appeal as much to me as companies that were sort of making products for different industries. And here's the lucky part, is that I did really get very lucky when I found an opportunity at what was then Tyco Healthcare here in the med device industry, and working with just an incredible group of leaders that I ended up just learning so much from.
So what is the interesting part for a lawyer to be in MedTech? I mean, you said already it's not like having a contract, then it's done. But what else is so interesting for you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, it's the same thing that's exciting about being in the medical device MedTech industry for anyone. You know, at the end of all of our work, there's a patient who's not well in some way, and a doctor or nurse, other medical professionals who are trying to help them. And it's our products and technology that are right in the middle of that. I mean, that's a tremendous opportunity. And, you know, I remind the teams I work with, the teams I've led all the time, how fortunate we are to be in that position. It's a lot of responsibility, particularly when you think about putting quality product on the market, reliable product on the market. It is a lot of responsibility. But particularly when you get a chance to hear patient stories, meet actual patients who have benefited from the products and the technology that we support, it's an incredible opportunity. And so first and foremost, that's the same as for anyone, but it has meant a lot to me. And I think in addition to that, just as a lawyer, our work is critical in the med device industry. The work of lawyers and compliance professionals in medtech is essential, because you really can't have a sustainable, long-term, successful business without really good grounding in how to run the business the right way, in a way that's not going to be disrupted by legal and compliance risks. And so we're positioned really well to add a lot of value to a business and to show our worth and our value when we integrate really well in the work that our colleagues across the business are doing. And so, you know, for those two reasons, the unique nature of the industry and relying upon legal and compliance to run the business the right way, and the patient value proposition, you know, it's just really a great place to be.
I find this interesting because from my perspective, as a sales and marketing professional, I always thought like maybe for the lawyers, it doesn't matter too much in which MedTech company they are. I mean, MedTech is one thing, but I didn't know that you care about the product so much. So the first company might have been maybe coincidence, but now when you change within the industry, what are you looking for then when you change a job?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I spent almost 20 years with the same company, although it went through a lot of changes during that time, including acquisition by Medtronic. And my own career went through a lot of changes in terms of roles. I was at corporate, I was in international, I was in a business unit, and eventually in a very senior leadership role when we were acquired by Medtronic. But then since then, I've been in a lot of different environments, including leaving the industry. Part of what I've learned is that, it's easy to take some things for granted. I was fortunate to be hired into a business with incredible leadership, really, really great leaders who were also great people and who led with humility and inclusiveness. And by that, I just mean like they wanted input from everyone. They wanted the right answer, not necessarily their opinion driving the decision. To be honest with you, I thought all good businesses ran that way. And it was a surprise to me later in my career to find out that businesses that from the outside looked very successful maybe didn't have that kind of leadership. So for me, it starts with leadership. I would put culture very high on that list.
Yeah.
Because I think that makes a huge difference from one company to another. And then I think a lot about, what's the strategy of this business? How does this business win? And that, as you both know, that's very different from company to company, and even within a company from business unit or product line one to another. So, that all of that helps me figure out, like, can I be successful here? Can this business be successful? Can I add value? And depending on the answers to those questions, the answer could be yes or no.
So Larry, when you mention Tycho and you're a lawyer, people who have been around a while are instantly going to connect Dennis Kozlowski, right? Were you around when the whole incident of, because Tycho back in the day, was an acquisition monster. Dennis Kozlowski, the CEO, was acquiring businesses throughout the Tyco Corporation. And eventually he was he was accused of embezzlement, right? And brought down. And what then happened was all the medical companies of Tyco were brought together under the umbrella of a new company called Covidien. Were you around at that time? Were you
Yeah, I
involved in that?
was. I was, yeah. So I was part of what made that opportunity so
Yeah,
attractive to me.
yeah,
I was a deal lawyer when I was working at the law firm, and
right.
the opportunity to be a part of a company, to go in house for the reasons I described, but still work on interesting, challenging transactional work was
Yeah,
really unique. And then once I got to know better what the strategy was for growing by acquisition as well as organically, the people who were working on the transactions were really great. People I
yes,
learned a lot from, and we did as much as possible ourselves.
right.
So that's how I got there. In part because of that acquisition strategy that our parent company Tyco was leading. And
Right.
yeah, I was there when all of those issues happened at the parent company, and it was very disruptive for a period of time. The deals stopped. Obviously, it had an impact on our stock price. Then there was turnover at the leadership level. And it was, I won't lie, it was embarrassing. Even though those issues had nothing at all to do with our business, it was embarrassing to be associated with. But it's one of many things that helped for me to build my own personal resiliency and my own mindset around the importance and value of leading resilient teams.
Yes.
Because, like I said, none of those issues had anything to do with us, but it certainly presented a situation we had to deal with.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that going on at every company today.
Yes.
All the teams at every company that spent the last few weeks trying to figure out what the impact of tariffs would be for their business, and then
Exactly.
putting it on hold and figuring out how to communicate with suppliers and customers, and then maybe putting that on hold.
Yeah.
That's life, man. Like you
Yeah.
gotta either figure out how to roll with it or you get rolled by it.
I think it was a pivotal moment in our industry because it's still a little controversial in that some people are saying that he was made a scapegoat, that as the board approved things, was he really doing what they were accusing him of doing? So if we put that to one side, it still it made everyone in the industry look at the industry and say, look, how do we do better? How do we do things differently in the future, especially in terms of ethics and compliance? And that just made us all better. people in departments like yours, the legal department. I joined Covidian very soon afterwards in the aftermath of this. And then what came down the pipe was a very clear structure on how we would operate ethically and compliantly going forward. And that foundation is very much still in place today, right?
Yeah, for sure. And, years later, we were acquired by Medtronic, which, similarly, Medtronic has a world-class legal and compliance function, and
Yes.
we mesh those cultures. For me, I think it reinforced, like I said,
Yeah.
the people who were leading our business were both great business leaders, but great people of really high integrity and low ego. And I mean that in the business sense, in terms of like having humility enough to like accept that their first idea might not be the best idea, and maybe someone else in the room, regardless of job title, might have a better idea. Sometimes it's helpful to see a cautionary tale of where someone gets a different idea about their own level of importance that goes beyond their role in an enterprise. When you see that, sometimes it can help remind everybody about the importance of doing business the right way. And I don't know that we needed that lesson at our business, but it definitely underscored it for me, and definitely also underscored the importance of really knowing about whether leadership of the organization you're going to join has alignment with your own values.
Yes. And it also did, by bringing all the different med device companies within the Tyco corporation together under one umbrella and creating Covidian, it created the eighth largest med device company in the world at the time, right? Which was also incredible. And these companies started to talk to one another like they'd never done in the past,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Well, there definitely was more. I mean, like I said, I was there for almost 20 years. We went through a lot of cycles. I think early on, we were a collection of companies through acquisition, really great brands, really great products.
Yeah.
I think as leadership changed, there was definitely more of an effort to think not just about whether we're in the right markets, do we have great products, but more of a focus on thinking about what clinician needs were, and are we solving the right problems for clinicians? And then I feel like after we joined Medtronic, the DNA at Medtronic, going back to Earl Bakken, is very much about the patient, particularly under Omar's tenure, Omar Ishraq, who was running the company when we were acquired and through my time there. Omar took that even further to think about, like, are we thinking about the whole patient journey? Not just the procedure where our products play, but what is that patient experiencing from beginning to end, and could we do better? Us, our customer, the system overall. So if you think about my career in medtech, each of those shifts has expanded my own thinking about how to think about our work and the organizations I'm a part of. And I think that's all very positive.
Larry, I would like to go one step back, if you don't mind, for people who studied law and might listen to this podcast and they have no idea what we are talking about, like legal and compliance and everything you were discussing. So maybe you can explain to these people who might consider MedTech as their next step. What areas are you covering as a lawyer in a medtech company?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. And I spent time at the law school I graduated from here in Boston University, has a great health law program. In a few years, I got involved. Excuse me. A few years ago, I got involved in a mentorship program there, because a lot of people don't understand what the med device industry is. What does the legal department do? It's, there's similarities with what legal departments look like in other industries. There's similarities to pharma and biotech, but then there are differences as well. And I've been fortunate to be able to lead teams of various sizes as general counsel. I think depending on the needs of the company, you could have a lot of different roles and a lot of different areas of legal expertise. But in broad strokes, if you think about the needs of the business, I mean, the legal function needs to support the needs of the business.
Yeah.
And so it comes from like, what is the business trying to accomplish? Where is it in its life cycle? What's the strategy of the business? Generally speaking, any medical device business is going to need a commercial team that's focused on contracts and related issues, an intellectual property team that's supporting the work of R&D and engineers and figuring out, like, while this team is coming up with the innovation that helps solve this clinical problem, are we protecting it, or are we just creating a market for everyone with that enormous investment that goes into that? And then compliance, as we talked about before, making sure the business is being run in a compliant fashion under local law, let's say US law, but also around the world, it can get very complicated and the rules can often conflict with each other. So in broad strokes, almost every team I've ever led has had people focused on those three areas. But then there's all sorts of other types of work that you're going to evaluate. Either I need people in-house who know how to do this, or I'm going to need to identify partnerships with outside law firms. M&A, where I came from, my background, if it's a public company, securities law, board governance, employment law, right? Every company is just a bunch of people working together. So employment law always figures into it. And then things like litigation, environmental, really depends on the business needs. And then if you think about the roles, I mean, I'm a generalist. I came from a background first doing deal work, then supporting the commercial teams, which is in and of itself kind of another kind of deal work, right? Like you've got a willing customer and a supplier and a sales rep that they've come to terms, but like somehow that's got to be documented. So in a way, that's a deal. But you have generalists who do a little bit of everything. And as a general counsel, it's right there in the name. You know, you generalist of all things legal and compliance. But you have specialists who have, let's say, a labor and employment lawyer or an intellectual property lawyer. And then in some cases, you have extreme specialists, right? They solve a problem, mostly at bigger companies. They solve a very discrete set of problems that are important to the business, but maybe they go really deep. They're not that wide, but they go really deep. And then like any other function, you've got individual contributor roles. Someone who does one thing, they do it really well. They're not managing a team. Maybe they don't ever want to. Then you've got folks who are managers. They're leading a team. They could be specialists or generalists, but they're leading a team. Maybe they're focused on a business and they're leading a team that supports that business, or maybe they're leading the labor and employment lawyers at a company. And then eventually you've got opportunities for leadership roles, like the ones that I've been in. And if you're fortunate enough, those can transcend into business leadership roles where you're part of the team running the business and your input is valued, whether it's a legal issue or not. And for me, that's the most fun.
Yeah. I mean, there are lawyers in MedTech who've gone on to become CEO of the entire company as well, right? Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And for a period of time in my last role, when we were going through CEO transition, I was a part of a group of members of leadership who helped, transition from one CEO to another. And it gives you just a different perspective. I will say, like, one of the things I learned early on from the people that I was fortunate to work with and work for was to take the perspective of running your function as though you were responsible for the entire business. And I have to admit, early on, that was tough for me to kind of assimilate into my thinking.
Yeah.
You get so much training as a lawyer. You're so focused on the specific value you bring to the business. It took a little bit of a transition, but if I had not made that transition, I think I could still be a successful lawyer. But I don't know if I would have gotten to the point of feeling like I could add value in any conversation.
So when you were recruiting your team of lawyers, did you ever ask them how much medical knowledge do you have?
I wouldn't ask it in that way.
Right.
There are people out there. There is a really talented director on my last company's board who's both a doctor and a lawyer.
Okay.
So there are people with that kind of expertise, and if you can get one of those on your leadership team or on your board, you're very lucky.
Yes.
But I will ask how much they know about the industry and if they have experience in the industry. But I've had very good success hiring people both with industry experience and without industry experience.
Yeah.
For me, what I'm looking for is a certain type of person who can be curious, who really likes to learn,
Yeah.
and who's collaborative. And I really also very much value communication skills. I think communication skills for a lawyer, really all three of those things that I just mentioned,
Yes.
you get enough of those people on your team, and that's the difference between the legal department that others in the company try to avoid
Yeah.
and the legal department that others in the company wouldn't think of having a meeting without.
I got to echo that because I think having dealt with you and your team in the past, it's, if you're thinking of getting into med device and you're a lawyer, you don't need a medical degree, right? Yeah, it's great if you have one, but the skill sets that you've just outlined is what's important. And then what's important is that be able to communicate in a non-legalese way to people within the organization, whether that be engineers, salespeople, marketing people, right? Why you can or cannot do something, or how you should or should not do something, um, and being able to just communicate that in a way that everyone can understand, right?
Yeah, that's right. Years ago, when I moved into a role with our surgical business, I
Yeah,
inherited two teams that previously reported to other colleagues of mine. We did a business reorg. One of the things I was trying to figure out is like, how do we, I use the word team a lot. You probably already noticed.
yeah,
One of the things I was trying to figure out is like, how do we get us all to really behave like a team? And so I was putting a lot of thought into, what should the shared values of this group be? And was talking with my HR business partner.
yeah,
We spent a lot of time thinking about like what makes a great legal team, what makes a great lawyer. She actually went out and interviewed some of my business partners who were leading the business and asked them those questions. When the legal team shows up great, what does that look like? When the legal team disappoints you, what does that look like? And
yes,
we ended up with a little bit of a workshop around how to have the right conversations with the business. And what you just said there, Cash, really reminded me of that because a lot of times as a lawyer, you'll be presented with an idea when your colleagues in the business think it's a finished product,
yes,
and they're looking for you to just thumbs up, thumbs down, rubber stamp it. And when that comes to you and there's a legal or compliance issue, it's a tough spot. You don't want to be a roadblock, but your job is to help prevent the business from making it a suboptimal decision, let's say.
yes,
And I think in the best circumstances when that happens, the right thing to do is not to present the conclusion, it's to start asking questions. Help me understand what you're trying to accomplish here. What's the end goal here? The more you get into that conversation, and ideally it would be much earlier than when it's really a finished product, it's very, very common that my teams would find out that the thing that presents the legal or compliance issue can be totally avoided. And the goals of the business can be achieved or maybe even surpassed by just doing it another way.
yeah,
And so that's a totally different conversation than, oh, you can't do this.
yes.
And so, yeah, I mean, like all the cliches, right? The legal department is the sales prevention department or the department of no.
That's
That results
accounting.
from situations where someone presents an answer the business doesn't want to hear, like a black
Yes,
box, right? The question went in, the answer came out, and nobody knows what happened in the middle.
yeah,
So the more you can avoid that, the better. The more you can have a real conversation, the better. Also, not for nothing, but that's how you learn about the
yeah.
business strategy, and that's how you build trust, and that's how you get invited to the next meeting, and that's how people from my team get invited to President's Club, even though it's unthinkable
Yeah.
that someone would want a lawyer to President's Club.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my experience, when I started as a sales rep, honestly, I thought like legal is either doing compliance training, which is boring, even if super necessary, or when you really had to talk to them, there was a serious issue. But when I grew in my career, it changed because we had a regular meeting. They were always invited. I think for a sales rep, they have no communication with the legal department in a normal way. But when you have common management meetings and you start talking, you start appreciating the legal department. So should that be changed maybe in a company to encourage more communication within the departments?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think success in a company, wherever you sit, is very largely dependent on collaboration and communication. And wherever that's suboptimal, even if the business is successful by its own standards or externally, you're underachieving. And I remember when we, as Cash mentioned, when we spun off, we were trying to figure out all sorts of things, including what are we going to call this company, but also like what are our values. And there was a whole initiative the HR team ran around like, what does great look like within our company? You know, what does it look like when we're performing well? And how does that show up? And how do we work that into what we're recruiting for? And communication and collaboration was really high on the list. I think wherever you have expertise that is very specific, you run the risk of getting ears. It can be legal, HR, finance. It can be the sales force, right? Like in some companies, the problem is the sales force because they don't feel like they need to collaborate with anyone. They just, we're the ones out there selling to the customer and everyone else just get behind us or get out of the way. I get that, but also that's not the right way to think. And so from my perspective, you have to prove that you can add value. If you don't, either as a team or individually, you're not going to get invited back. And then you are part of the problem. But when you prove you can add value and you get invited back and you're given the opportunity to put ideas on the table that maybe aren't even legal ideas, they're just good ideas about the business, then that's the good stuff. And I think sometimes people need to be shown that that's an opportunity. Sometimes they just haven't experienced it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, medical device companies are so disruptive in the thing. We're always coming up with new ways of doing things. But we have to then come and check. And you've been involved in so many of these disruptive technologies, right? You know, one that comes to mind is you worked at the Butterfly Network, right? Where they make a portable ultrasound that's handheld and can be used anywhere in the world and connected to an iPad. That, you know, that's just awesome technology. Makes absolute sense, right? But we have, it's always good to come over to the legal department and show what we're doing and say, what are the potential risks? Can we do this? How do we do this correctly? Because let's just take that example, right? What if somebody in a remote area uses the device and makes a misdiagnosis, right? Because it's viewing ultrasound images is not what they do day in, day out, like somebody in hospital whose job is only that. What then becomes the legal liability for the company? Right? These are things that you need to consider, even though as an engineer, you've made a brilliant product. And as a salesperson, you've sold a brilliant product.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I think we talked before about trying to solve clinician needs, unmet patient needs, and clinician needs. And there's a lot of collaboration. Yesterday, I was at our R&D center at AngioDynamics. I'm talking with some of the engineers about some of the things they're working on. Just to get to the point of what they showed me, it's sales reps out in the field talking to clinicians about real challenges they're having, whether they're using our product or someone else to meet a patient need. They're communicating that back. They're talking to our engineers about like, well, could you make it like this? Could you make it like that? They're talking to our patent attorneys to say like, well, if we could make it like that, is there a clear path to getting that to market? There's so many people that get into that conversation before you even have a product, right? And then that product needs to be somehow turned into a business. There needs to be a business case for it.
Yeah.
We have issues around in our industry around, how are hospitals and clinicians going to get paid if this goes to market? Are they properly incentivized in order for it to be a good business decision for them, even if we think it's a good clinical decision? All along the way, there's so many needs for people to be connecting. And I think in a healthy company, the legal compliance team can sit in the middle of all of that and get pulled into all of those conversations And that's what's fun. It's fun to try to help figure out those problems. Folks who end up going to law school, and they're people with analytical minds. They like thinking through
Yes.
complex challenges, and so it's natural for us to want to get in the middle of all those questions. And when you can do it with an innovative technology, whether it's something like the butterfly device, first ever semiconductor-based handheld portable ultrasound, which unlocks the ability to use it in applications that previously couldn't be used before, or some of the things that we're working on at AngioDynamics right now. It presents a unique set of challenges, right? Like around
like robotics, right? So you were there when we switched people from open surgery to laparoscopic surgery.
Right.
And then we said, all right, now let's switch them from laparoscopic surgery to robotic surgery.
That's right. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I mean, I was in the surgical business competing with Intuitive. And when we started thinking about whether it made sense for us to be a new market entrant in the surgical robotics space, what that would mean for our business, what kind of a project would it require from an R&D perspective, obviously considerations around intellectual property. We had a high amount of integrity around intellectual property and respecting the IP of others, and a whole host of questions around how do you develop, test, commercialize something like that were new for us. We were not in that space before. That was a really fun project to be a part of, fun project for my teams to be a part of. Interesting at times. There are some interesting issues that came up along the way where, as we tried to, like I said, respect and navigate around other intellectual property, you run into some healthy tension with the engineers and with the marketing teams who want certain features. And while they probably wouldn't admit it, there's some feature in a lot of projects I've worked on in the past. There's features of the product when they come to market that wouldn't have existed if not for the IP team saying, well, actually, we shouldn't do that because we're going to be stepping on someone's IP. Like I said before, let's figure out what was that feature supposed to do for the clinician or the patient. Is there another way to do it? They won't admit, they won't want to give the legal team credit, but there are plenty of examples where people that worked on my teams were responsible for features that at one point they were thinking was, more like a bug or a challenge.
When I listen to
You mentioned earlier.
I have the feeling you have such a deep product knowledge as well. Is it because you need it to get the job done, or is it just because you're so excited about the product the company does?
Yeah, I'd say both. I mean, I'm not an intellectual property lawyer, but I've managed intellectual property teams. Intellectual property lawyers are engineers who then got a law degree. So they're deeply involved. So for me to be able to stand the work those teams are doing, I had to get comfortable asking stupid questions. I am very comfortable asking stupid questions and telling people who are much smarter than me, hey, do me a favor, explain that to me like I'm a child, write it in crayon. You cannot insult my intelligence. So that's what I was talking about before, that curiosity, a little humility to be willing to say, I am definitely not the smartest person in the room. Back up and explain that to me again. Also, like I mentioned before, I'm very fortunate to work with great leaders. I can think of so many people I worked for who would show up at a business review and it wouldn't be just about the numbers. We'd want to see what the R&D team was working on. We'd want to give them a chance to present. They would be asking, hey, walk me through, why does this feature matter? Just being around that validated my own curiosity in understanding the work that they were doing. And I've done that ever since. And it's part of the reason why yesterday when I was at our R&D center for a totally different meeting, I made it a point to spend some time with the engineers, having them walk me through what they're working on. To me, it's exciting.
I could tell this story now because the company doesn't really exist anymore. But when I was interviewing at Covidian, you talked earlier about you talked earlier about what are we going to call the company, right? So I went for my interview with Stefano Alfonsi at in Zurich at the lovely hotel, and he pulled out the new name of the company is going to be, and he pulled out his sign. It said Covidian, and he said it means code together, V, life, D, and all in Latin. And I went, yeah, but it says die in English right there in the middle, right? And he flipped the sign around and went, yeah, and threw it over his shoulder and went, that cost a lot of money. And I left, I was driving home thinking, it's so stupid. Why did you make that comment? And the next day he called me up and offered me the job. So it was,
But to that point, Cash, in addition, I think today a lot of, I mean, not only salespeople, everyone in the company is very active on social media, let it be LinkedIn, Instagram, or whatever. And especially when I was in aesthetics, we had a lot of issues with people posting or reposting from celebrities, which they always thought like, oh, it's public, so I can repost it, which is not the case because it has to be part of the contract. So did this change? I don't know if it affects you as well in your company, but did all these social media activities of employees change your job?
Well, it's another set of issues. And it's one of those things, like, having been in the industry for this long, I sort of have lived through the transition from it being not an issue to being a curiosity. But yeah, real issues come up, particularly around like marketing, right? There's a right and a wrong way to market medical devices and medical technology. You've got employees who are super excited about what they're working on, both with companies I've supported and talking to colleagues in legal at other companies. You get issues where you have people commenting on things about the company or maybe responding to posts that your company has put up there, and there's a right and a wrong way to respond to that. So yeah, there's a whole host of challenges that presents for a lot of people, for marketing, for communications, for the sales teams, and then for legal. And I think for us, I think we try to figure out how can we help come up with practical advice around this. What's the right way to deal with it? Sometimes the right way to deal with it is to leave it alone,
right.
Yeah.
But that was a whole educational process that we had to go through as an industry, right? Which I think you guys at Legal really helped set the rules there in terms of, hey, what should we or should you not be commenting on? And do you know you're legally liable for what you send out there? And, are you communicating claims that haven't been validated by
Right.
any clinical study or anything like
with
that?
the best of
So,
intentions, usually. I mean, I think
yeah.
the approach my teams try to take is like, this is a help me help you situation, and I think in the healthiest of companies, legal and compliance isn't viewed as sort of the police or the monitor of this sort of thing. It's more like, all right, well, I understand what you're trying to do. Let me help you come up with the right way to handle that. And, when we can do that, then it's constructive.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important to have team members like yourselves on who can help the rest of the organization through this. So just think about things that they never thought of in the
Right.
past.
That's right.
So what do you think was, of all the products that you've helped get to market, is there any one that you're particularly proud of?
That's a good question. It's a good question. I'm not sure what my answer would be to that. I mean, I loved being associated with the robotics project. I think the folks who are still working in that business probably don't yet still even know what the long-term impact of that's going to be. Obviously, there are a lot of people who've since entered into robotics, and I think in our careers, we've seen robotics go from a curiosity to a disruptive player.
Yes.
And we're close to the point of it becoming just the norm.
Yeah.
And I think being a part of the leadership team that made the decision that this is disruptive to our business, but it's good for patients and it will require an enormous investment of time and resources, a lot of which we don't have resident within our team, but it's the right thing to do. That was a pretty courageous decision by the team that made that call. And I learned so much from the people who worked on that project that I think I probably would go with that, even though I would say I played a very small role in it, but just being around it and being associated with it and having a front row seat to the work that some extremely talented people did to get that to market.
Yeah. I mean, for me, there's loads of areas where you guys have just, in some of the A stuff, being able to bring a company and then going acquiring a missing part, putting that together so that that product can come together,
Yeah.
and what you do does end up changing the way medicine is practiced for the better, right? I think of the VLOC suture, for example, right? Where now, since the beginning of time, there hasn't been that many innovations in suture technology. We're probably the oldest medical device ever invented. But a VLOC suture is a suture that has barbs running across it, so it only passes one way through the tissue, and it's a self-locking device. You don't need to tie a knot, right? That's revolutionized. In fact, robotic prostatectomy surgery is very difficult to do without the invention of a VLOC
Yeah.
suture,
Yeah.
for example.
It's incredible. I mean, some of the things, including some of the things that haven't been brought to market, some of the things that teams come up with in the mission to help solve clinician problems, it's really remarkable to see it. And as you said, suturing is a very old concept, but you'd be
Yes.
shocked how much intellectual property there is around that. Early in my career, I supported our incontinent care business, and I would not have imagined that there was as much intellectual property involved in incontinence products and diapers as there is, but
Yes.
it's quite a bit. And behind all of that
Yeah.
is an engineer with an idea,
Yes. And also, so I know that Covidien and J&J were in the same market, right? So Ethicon, J&J, we were competing with each other, at least in the sales arena. But I also learned later on that, there's a lot of legal activity happening between the two companies. So you must get to know the lawyers on the others in some of the other companies quite
Yeah,
well.
for sure.
Right?
Yeah. And when I was in the surgical business, we had a series of lawsuits, both where we were
Yes.
offense and defense, and with some significant wins and some disappointing results at times. Litigation necessarily is adversarial, right? Inherently.
Right.
I'm not an inherently adversarial person. And when I went into the law, I gravitated towards business and then towards deals, which is about, finding value for both sides.
Right.
So my approach has always been that we can be on different sides of something, but it doesn't mean that we need to be disagreeable people. And I'm also quite sensitive to the fact that when you make the choice to be a lawyer at a company, you're making a very different choice about your career than if you decide to be a lawyer at a law firm. It's not a better or worse choice. It's just a different choice. At a law firm, legal advice is the work product of the business that you work for. And as general counsel or an attorney at a company, that is not the case. So our legal advice needs to facilitate a good business result. And so there are cases where I might think the right thing to do is to fight over an issue for legal reasons.
Right.
But that may be the wrong thing to do for a business. And so I've always felt that you want to be in a position where if the right thing to do is to find an off-ramp for both parties from a legal issue that is either a dispute or actual litigation, you're going to find an off-ramp more easily if you develop some kind of a relationship and some kind of trust. You can have a positive relationship and trust even with a party you have an adversarial relationship. The best sales reps that I have met know their competitors who they're competing against for business, and they have healthy competition, but they have healthy respect as well. And I think that can be hard to come by sometimes within the legal profession, but to me, it's the right way to carry on, my part of the business.
Larry, did we forget to ask something or cover some areas for people who might want to join MedTech who have studied law?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think that the only other thing I maybe would want to emphasize, which can get lost, is the opportunity you have when you make a choice to work at a company and not a law firm. And as I said earlier, Cash, when you were asking me about how I've thought about different companies I've worked at, when you make a choice to work at a company that has the right leadership and the right culture, is to really think broadly about what you can accomplish and the value you can add, both in terms of your career, but even just how you carry yourself in any given meeting in any given moment. So you asked me earlier about times when folks in the business might have a less than positive view of the legal team or of lawyers. That can be challenging, but I think there are times when we put our own constraints on what we can do for a business. And I just really encourage lawyers and other legal professionals who are thinking about a career in medtech to really think broadly about where you can add value, how you can participate, and where you can be engaged. I've been really fortunate to have the opportunity to work on all sorts of things that you wouldn't necessarily ask a lawyer to do. I've been a part of really transformational culture initiatives. When I tell people that a lawyer was asked to do that and to be executive sponsor of a culture initiative, it seems surprising. I had a boss years ago who once introduced me as, "This is my lawyer, but don't worry about it. He's not a normal lawyer." I think it was a compliment. I've led a huge divestiture of ours, not as the deal lawyer, but trying to help lead the team. What do we need to do to get this business together? And at this point in my career, I've been fortunate to lead multiple functions other than legal. And so I think I really would encourage people to think more broadly, because I think there's a lot of opportunity that comes from that. Today I'm involved in a couple of boards, and I think the more broadly you think about how you can add value, the more diverse your career becomes. And as you get further along in your career, you can add value in a lot of different ways.
Fantastic. So, Larry, what were the three things that you know now that you wish you'd known then? Then being much earlier in your career.
I think I may have actually touched on some of this already, but I think being curious is the first one.
Yeah.
In our industry, you have the opportunity to work with some brilliant people across multiple functions. I spent time yesterday with one of the people who was once chief medical officer that worked with me. I learned so much from being around him. The engineers, as I mentioned before, I learned a lot from people in finance that I've worked with who've given me kind of that lens. So really be curious. Think about where people to the left and the right of you can mentor you without you even calling it that, by just giving you exposure to how they think about the business that you're working in together. As I mentioned before, think broadly about your job and your career and your opportunity to contribute. That pays so many dividends for you and changes the way people think about you in your company and in your work. And then the last one may seem a little bit counterintuitive given what we're talking about, but the advice I'd give myself now that I maybe didn't have then is that you're not your job. I think that our jobs are very important. I've always said, like, my job is important, but that doesn't make me important. And it's good to have that kind of humility. But we all work so hard, it's easy to kind of get into the trap where you start to think that's all the value you bring is the value you contribute in your job. And I think paradoxically, we all contribute the most when we've got some balance in our lives. And it's not obvious, you can get so pulled into the work that we do, because at the end as a patient and the work that we do is so important and there's an endless opportunity to contribute. But I think to keep that in check, to understand that you're not your job and you have other equally often more important things in your life that you need your energy and attention for. When you feed that part of your life, you do have more to bring to the table when you are fully focused on your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Larry, thank you very much for today. I think my advice to people who are in med device companies is, get to know your legal team in your company. I've always found it so valuable and educational, working with you and your team members and other lawyers that I've worked with and work with today. And so, take the time out, get to know who those people are, invite them to lunch. It will be a great use of your time. And as you've illustrated so well, it's such a great career option for lawyers who are looking for a fulfilling, rewarding, and fascinating career right, to get into the medical device industry.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, I feel really fortunate and grateful to have had the opportunity to work in this industry, to still have the opportunity to work in the industry. And yeah, it's been terrific. And I've enjoyed the conversation today. So I appreciate you both having me on. It's good to
Thank
talk
you
with
so
you.
much for being with us today, Larry.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for tuning into our MedTech Lives. You have been listening to Zilka Rima and Tash Ikran. We're committed to bringing you insights and stories that inspire and inform the medical community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network.